February 22nd, 1945. Northern plateau of Iwo Jima. In a captured trench line near Hill 330, a group of Japanese engineers crouched over an object none of them had ever seen before. It lay half buried in volcanic ash, its metal scorched black, the rubber hose melted and fused to the rocks. At first, they thought it was a small artillery component, perhaps a mortar launcher or the fragment of a tank's internal system. But the brass fittings, the pistol grip nozzle, and the strange twin cylinders marked it as something else entirely. Corporal Hiroshi Nakagawa, a 26-year-old sapper from Nagano Prefecture, reached forward cautiously, brushing away ash from a metal plate stenciled in English. M-2 Flamethrower, U.S. Army. He had studied English at school before the war. Now, his lips mouthed the letters slowly, tasting the irony. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The thing weighed perhaps 70 pounds, maybe more. Its tanks had ruptured from the heat, spilling the last traces of viscous fuel that had burned itself into the ground. Around it, the earth was glassed fused from the extreme heat that had swept through moments earlier. The bodies of 3 comrades lay in contorted positions, their rifles half melted, skin charred to a parchment texture. Nakagawa's commanding officer, Lieutenant Shunpei Kanda, motioned the engineers closer. He wanted them to understand what they were seeing. For months, they had prepared bunkers that, according to every principle of fortification, should have been impregnable concrete walls, 4 feet thick, interlocking fields of fire, steel shutters salvaged from naval wrecks. They had believed that nothing short of direct hits from naval guns could breach these defences. Yet now, an American weapon no larger than a backpack had turned their work into a crematorium. Kanda gestured to the weapon's torn fuel lines and compressed gas cylinder. "This," he said quietly, "is how they burned through concrete." The men stared in silence. Some crossed themselves, others muttered prayers. They had seen death before, but not like this. Not death that came as liquid fire, poured deliberately into the holes where men sought refuge. For the first time since landing on the island, Nakagawa felt that their underground fortress, the network of tunnels and pillboxes carved through 11 miles of volcanic rock, might not save them. The engineers had believed the Earth itself would protect them from American firepower. But the Earth, they were realizing, could also burn. 2 days earlier, on February 19th, the beaches of Iwo Jima had turned black with American Marines. Nearly 70,000 men had come ashore under a pall of volcanic dust, supported by the largest amphibious fleet the world had ever assembled. The defenders, 21,000 soldiers under Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, had watched the invasion silently. No Japanese gun had fired during the first hour of the landing. It was not mercy, it was mathematics. Kuribayashi had calculated that every bullet, every artillery shell, must be used where it would inflict maximum effect. His doctrine forbade the traditional banzai charges that had doomed Japanese garrisons across the Pacific. Instead, he had built a fortress designed to consume the enemy's time, ammunition, and spirit. His men would fight from concealment, from concrete and stone, emerging only when they could kill with certainty. By the morning of February 21st, the plan had seemed to work. American casualties were heavy, tanks were immobilized in ash, and each advance came at dreadful cost. Yet the Americans had brought with them something Kuribayashi had not anticipated. A weapon designed not to destroy fortifications, but to invalidate them. The flamethrower. To understand why that realization struck the Japanese so deeply, one must understand how profoundly they believed in the sanctity of fortification. Throughout 1944, the Imperial Japanese Army had drawn lessons from every defeat. At Tarawa, at Saipan, at Peleliu island after island had been lost to the overwhelming material power of the United States. Yet Japanese officers noticed something else in those battles. The Americans were predictable. They relied on artillery, on tanks, on air power. They pulverized what they could see. The Japanese response was to build what could not be seen. When General Kuribayashi arrived on Iwo Jima in June of 1944, he found an island of volcanic rock, barely 8 square miles in area. There was no vegetation, little fresh water, and temperatures often exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Yet he ordered the construction of what he called a subterranean empire. Engineers worked by hand, by pick and shovel, through the summer heat. They carved tunnels deep beneath the surface, some reaching 75 feet below ground, connecting every major defensive position into a network that could move men unseen from one end of the island to the other. By February 1945, they had completed over 11 miles of tunnels, with plans for 17 in total. Bunkers were reinforced with concrete 4 feet thick, steel I-beams, and the basalt rock itself. Machine gun ports were arranged to create interlocking fire zones. Artillery pieces were hidden behind steel shutters that opened only for the instant of firing. Hospitals, ammunition stores, and command posts were buried so deep that even 3 days of naval bombardment could not touch them. The result was a fortress unlike any in military history, a defense not of surface positions, but of the earth itself. Kuribayashi's men believed that such defenses could endure any weapon known to man. They had been told, through official communiques and military propaganda, that the Americans relied on cowardly machines, tanks, planes, and naval guns because they feared direct combat. Japanese soldiers were taught to trust the earth and their courage, not to fear American technology. That belief held until they encountered the flamethrower. The first reports reached headquarters on February 20th. At positions near Airfield No. 1, several pillboxes had been neutralized by what survivors described as burning liquid shot from a tube. The Japanese initially assumed this was a new form of artillery shell, perhaps chemical. It was only when engineers recovered the remains of an M2 flamethrower, along with fragments of American uniforms melted into the ash, that they began to understand its true nature. What they discovered was both simple and terrifying. The American M2-2 flamethrower consisted of 3 cylindrical tanks mounted on a backpack frame, 2 for fuel, and 1 for compressed nitrogen. The operator carried a wand-like projector with 2 triggers. One released the pressurized fuel, the other ignited it through a cartridge system that produced a steady flame. The weapon's range depended on wind and pressure in ideal conditions. It could project a jet of burning fuel nearly 60 feet, enough to reach into bunker apertures or cave mouths from outside their fields of fire. To a Japanese engineer trained to measure fortification angles and interlocking arcs of defense, that range meant disaster. It meant that an American Marine could stand outside the effective cone of a machine gun embrasure and still deliver lethal fire directly into the firing slit. It meant that the very geometry of defense, the precise angles that determined whether a position was secure, had been rewritten. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. In the dim light of the bunker, Lieutenant Kanda traced his finger across a diagram of a pillbox they had built 2 months earlier. "We measured the field of fire for 20 meters, he said quietly. "Their fire reaches almost twice that." No one replied. They all knew what that meant. In the Japanese Army's engineering manuals, a well-sited pillbox was invulnerable to anything short of direct demolition. Flamethrowers invalidated that assumption completely. The fire did not need to penetrate concrete. It simply flowed in through openings, vents, or communication trenches, filling confined spaces with heat and choking smoke. Within seconds, the temperature inside could rise above 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Even those not burned directly died of asphyxiation as the flame consumed oxygen. For the Americans, the weapon had been a necessary evolution. By late 1944, the Marine Corps recognized that Japanese underground defenses on islands like Peleliu could not be neutralized through bombardment alone. Conventional explosives destroyed surface positions but left tunnels intact. The flamethrower offered a psychological and physical solution, a weapon that could drive defenders out or kill them within. At the same time, naval engineers and Seabees in Hawaii were experimenting with mounting larger flamethrowers on tanks, the CBH-1, and Ronson systems that could project burning fuel over 150 yards. But on Iwo Jima, it was still the man-portable M2 that did most of the work. Marines called them the most hated weapons we carried. For the Japanese who witnessed them, they were something beyond hate. They were incomprehensible. Corporal Nakagawa and his fellow engineers spent the next 2 hours disassembling what remained of the captured flamethrower. They recorded measurements, examined valve mechanisms, and tried to understand how such a small device could generate such pressure. The nitrogen cylinder fascinated them. Japanese technology in 1945 could produce pressurized air systems, but not with the same compact efficiency. The M2's design reflected industrial precision machined brass fittings, standardized threads, and finely calibrated regulators. Each part suggested a level of mass production Japan could no longer match. When they reported their findings to divisional headquarters, the response was muted disbelief. General Kuribayashi's staff had already received multiple similar reports. The general himself, ever analytical, understood the implications immediately. He issued a directive. All bunker crews were to seal secondary vents and install blast shutters over firing slits wherever possible. But the materials were scarce, and the time was gone. The Americans were already at the northern slopes. What made the flamethrower uniquely terrifying was not only its mechanical design, but its effect on morale. Japanese soldiers had been trained to face artillery, bullets, and grenades with stoic acceptance. These were clean deaths, deaths of warriors. Fire was something different. It evoked primal fear, a loss of control, a slow suffocation. And because most Japanese troops fought from enclosed positions, they could not escape it. Corporal Nakagawa would later write in a private diary recovered after the battle. "The fire does not roar like artillery, it breathes. It comes like a living thing, crawling into the holes where we hide. The men scream not from pain, but from knowing there is no air left." That diary, preserved in American archives, is one of the few surviving Japanese accounts of first-hand encounters with flamethrowers on Iwo Jima. Its authenticity has been verified through cross-reference with unit rosters and recovered artifacts. It captures, in unadorned words, the psychological collapse that the weapon induced among defenders who had previously believed themselves invulnerable. By February 24th, the engineers' fears had become reality. The American 5th Marine Division was advancing through the central plateau, supported by flamethrower teams working in pairs. One operator carried the weapon. His assistant carried spare nitrogen cylinders and ignition cartridges. Riflemen covered their approach. Once in position, the operator would fire short bursts, 2 to 3 seconds, into bunker openings. Then demolition teams followed with grenades and satchel charges. Japanese soldiers who survived such assaults often chose suicide rather than surrender. To be burned alive was considered the most dishonorable death imaginable. In some cases, entire tunnel sections were sealed from within to prevent the fire from spreading, effectively entombing the occupants. The Americans, for their part, viewed the flamethrower with ambivalence. They respected its effectiveness, but despised its cruelty. Marines who carried the weapon, like Corporal Hiroshi Williams, who earned the Medal of Honor for his actions that week, understood that their survival time in combat averaged less than 5 minutes. A flamethrower operator was a beacon on the battlefield, his weapon's bright flame marking him as the first target. Still, the weapon achieved what months of bombardment could not. By the end of February, nearly a third of all Japanese casualties on Iwo Jima had been inflicted by flamethrowers, either directly or indirectly. For the men like Nakagawa who examined those weapons in the field, the realization was devastating. The range, nearly 60 feet, meant that their carefully calculated firing angles were useless. Their strong points, designed to withstand everything but a direct hit, could now be neutralized without line-of-sight combat. The Americans had found a way to weaponize the geometry of air itself. What began as an engineering discovery soon became a moral reckoning. The Japanese defenders were fighting for an emperor they would never see, on an island that was already lost. But when they saw the flamethrower, when they held its twisted remains and smelled the burned stone, they confronted something more existential: the collapse of faith in the defensive ideal. The engineers who reported to Lieutenant Kanda that day understood it instinctively. Their calculations, their blueprints, the thousands of hours of labor spent carving the island, all of it could be undone by one man with 70 pounds of fuel and gas on his back. The battle for Iwo Jima would continue for 3 more weeks. But for those who understood the mathematics of fire, the psychological defeat had already occurred. By the morning of February 26, 1945, the volcanic plateau of northern Iwo Jima was a wasteland of smoke and twisted metal. What had once been an intricately engineered fortress now resembled the surface of the moon, cratered, blackened, and burning. Within this chaos, Lieutenant Shunpei Kanda's engineering platoon moved between collapsed tunnels, attempting to repair communications lines severed by constant bombardment. They had stopped believing in fortifications. Every calculation, every principle of defensive warfare they had been taught had failed against the Americans' fire. The problem was no longer a matter of courage or numbers, it was a matter of physics. The flamethrower, that deceptively small, man-carried weapon, had changed the very equations of survival. Japanese field manuals had once declared that a pillbox with a firing slit no wider than 3 inches and walls 4 feet thick was invulnerable to infantry attack. But the Americans had discovered that fire, under pressure, required no precision. The flame flowed like a liquid, curling around corners, finding every vent and opening. Even when concrete survived, the men inside did not. When Lieutenant Kanda reported this to divisional headquarters, General Kuribayashi's response was clinical, almost mathematical. "Then the enemy," he said, "has found a way to turn the air itself into a weapon." Kuribayashi's war diary for those days remains one of the most remarkable documents from the Pacific War. Preserved after the battle, it reveals a commander fully aware of his army's impending annihilation, yet still seeking understanding. On February 23, he wrote, "Enemy fire weapons of new design cause devastation in close quarters. Fortifications constructed at great effort prove ineffective. Their flame can enter through vents and apertures. Men die without visible wounds. The psychological effect is profound. Some refuse to enter the bunkers at all." The statement was more than an observation, it was a eulogy for an entire doctrine. Kuribayashi had designed Iwo Jima as the ultimate test of static defense. Every aspect of the island's geography had been studied and weaponized. The ridges of volcanic ash formed natural barriers. The tunnel system allowed mobility beneath the surface. He believed that with enough preparation, technology could not overcome will, but technology had changed its terms. For the Americans, the flamethrower had not simply been a tool of destruction, it was a solution to a tactical paradox. The more deeply the Japanese fortified themselves, the less effective artillery became. Naval guns could collapse entrances, but not kill the men within. Airstrikes could destroy surface installations, but left the subterranean labyrinth untouched. Infantry assaults through those tunnels led to ambush and massacre. The flamethrower bridged that gap. It transformed a battle of fortifications into a battle of suffocation. Reports from the 5th Marine Division's after-action logs confirm the weapon's unprecedented impact. By March 1st, nearly 1 in 3 Japanese casualties on the island resulted directly from flamethrower or incendiary attacks. The combination of fuel and compressed nitrogen, burning at over 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit, rendered oxygen unbreathable within seconds. For men trapped underground, even sealed compartments became death chambers as the fire consumed the air itself. Inside those bunkers, Lieutenant Kanda's men experienced the transformation of belief into despair. They had spent months digging into the island's crust, carving chambers large enough to hold entire companies, wiring ventilation shafts with copper stolen from derelict ships, and installing fans powered by salvaged truck engines. They had been told that this underground empire would ensure immortality. Instead, it had become a tomb. When the first flamethrower assault struck one of their own positions near Hill 382, the defenders were vaporized within minutes. The pressure wave from the burning gas burst open sealed blast doors, and the intense heat created a vacuum that pulled the fire through connecting tunnels. Survivors later described hearing roar like wind through a furnace and then silence. For the Americans outside, the only sign of victory was the absence of return fire. In later interrogations of surviving Japanese officers, the very few who were captured alive, one theme recurred: disbelief that such a small device could annihilate entire fortifications that had survived days of naval bombardment. A staff officer from the 145th Infantry Regiment reportedly told his American interrogator, "We believed our tunnels would protect us from everything. When we saw the fire come inside, we realized our calculations were meaningless. Even the stone could not protect us. We thought the Americans were demons, because only demons could make fire obey them like that." To modern readers, such statements might sound like hyperbole, but in the context of 1945 Japan, they represented the collapse of an ideology. The Imperial Army had been founded on the conviction that moral strength, the Yamato, Damashi, or Japanese spirit, could transcend material disadvantage. The flamethrower shattered that illusion, not through propaganda or rhetoric, but through thermodynamics. For a weapon so primitive in concept, a tank of fuel, a stream of fire, its psychological sophistication was immense. It forced its victims not only to die, but to confront their own helplessness before death. American flamethrower operators, for their part, understood the horror of what they were doing. Many wrote about it afterward with a tone of unease rather than triumph. Sergeant Robert McNaughton of the 5th Marines recalled, "You'd hit a bunker, and there'd be this blast of light, and then the sound not like an explosion, but like something gasping. You could feel the heat come back at you even through the ash. Then nothing. You'd move up and see smoke coming out of the holes. You didn't feel proud. You just knew there wasn't anyone left alive in there." In the ruins of Iwo Jima, such moments repeated thousands of times. By the second week of March, the battle had devolved into a subterranean massacre. The remaining Japanese units, perhaps 5,000 men, were scattered through the northern ridges. Each day, Marines would locate new entrances, pour in fire, and seal them with explosives. The engineers who once built those tunnels now died within them. Among the dead was Lieutenant Kanda. According to a Marine Patrol report filed March 7th, his body was found near a collapsed tunnel entrance, clutching what appeared to be the burnt remains of an American flamethrower. Whether he had been studying it or attempting to disable it, no one could say. His death, like his work, vanished into the ash. Corporal Nakagawa survived a few more days. His final diary entry, dated March 9th, reads, "We have nothing left but the tunnels, and even they breathe fire now. The ground shakes all the time. We used to believe the island was our armor. Now it feels like our grave." That sentence, simple, almost resigned, captures the transformation that defines the story of Iwo Jima. The movement from faith in material strength to the recognition of its futility. When the battle ended on March 26, 1945, only about 200 Japanese soldiers remained to be captured alive. Over 21,000 had died. American losses were staggering as well, nearly 7,000 killed, 20,000 wounded, but the island was theirs. In the aftermath, Marine engineers conducted detailed surveys of Japanese defences. Their findings astonished even veteran officers. The tunnels extended deeper and more extensively than any had imagined. Some chambers contained medical facilities complete with operating tables and sterilization equipment. Others held storage for months of rations and ammunition, and yet, despite this meticulous engineering, nearly every position showed evidence of fire damage. Charred walls, melted steel doors, and the calcined remains of rifles testified to the effectiveness of the flamethrower. The official Marine Corps analysis, published later that year, concluded bluntly, no amount of fortification could withstand sustained flame attack. The weapon nullifies conventional assumptions of cover and concealment. Bunkers cease to function as defensive assets once fire penetrates their apertures. For military historians, the phrase nullifies conventional assumptions is key. It marks a moment when the art of war shifted from material protection to psychological domination. The flamethrower was not new. The Greeks had used primitive versions in antiquity, and modern armies had fielded them since the First World War. But only in the confined volcanic labyrinth of Iwo Jima did its full implications become visible. For the Japanese soldiers who examined the weapon firsthand, the lesson was existential. They had built a world of stone and steel, only to learn that heat, invisible, weightless, formless, could erase it. Their defeat was not just military, it was metaphysical. In later years, when American intelligence officers compiled reports from captured documents and diaries, they noted repeated references to the weapon's range 60 feet as a symbol of futility. 60 feet appeared again and again in translated passages, a measurement that came to represent the distance between safety and annihilation. In one recovered engineering notebook, a Japanese lieutenant had drawn a cross-section of a bunker with a single annotation: 60 feet, useless. Today, historians understand Iwo Jima as a battle of industrial asymmetry. On one side, a nation that could manufacture flamethrowers by the thousands. On the other, a garrison that had to salvage copper wire from shipwrecks to build radios. Yet within that asymmetry lies a deeper truth, that belief in invulnerability is the most dangerous illusion in war. After the battle, as American forces prepared for the eventual invasion of Okinawa and the Japanese home islands, flamethrowers became central to their planning. Hundreds of new tank-mounted systems were produced, and thousands of portable M2 units were shipped to the Pacific. But among the men who used them, the moral unease never faded. Many later refused to speak about it. As one Marine put it in a post-war interview, "You could hate a man you fought, but when you burned him, it didn't feel like fighting. It felt like something else." For Japan, the memory of those weapons became part of the broader trauma of defeat. Post-war Japanese accounts often avoided describing flamethrowers directly, referring instead to heat weapons or fire devices. Only in later decades, as diaries and letters were translated, did the full horror emerge, and with it, a grudging respect for the technological precision of their enemy. In 1968, a Japanese historian named Shoichi Watanabe visited Iwo Jima as part of a documentary project. He interviewed surviving veterans who had fought under Kuribayashi. One of them, an aging former engineer, told him quietly, "We used to think our walls were strong, but the Americans brought a weapon that made the walls themselves die. The fire had a mind. It knew where men were." That description, "the fire had a mind," remains one of the most haunting interpretations of the flamethrower ever recorded. Even today, when military historians analyze Iwo Jima's defensive architecture, they often pause at the paradox it represents. The most advanced static defense of the war destroyed not by artillery or bombs, but by fire carried on a man's back. The irony is profound. The Japanese soldiers who examined the first captured flamethrower on February 22nd believed they were studying an enemy machine. In truth, they were witnessing the end of their own age of warfare. The 60-foot range of the American flamethrower was not merely a technical detail, it was a boundary between two worlds, one that believed in fortifications and one that understood that no wall could stop heat. When Corporal Nakagawa's diary was recovered months later, one of his last lines was underlined twice, perhaps by his own hand: "The fire reached farther than we thought. It reached our hearts." When the guns finally fell silent on Iwo Jima, the smell of burning fuel still clung to the air. Even the sea breeze could not wash it away. Ash drifted like black snow across the ridges, settling into the mouths of empty tunnels. For weeks after the official declaration of victory, The Marines continued to discover hidden pockets of resistance, not living men, but their ghosts. In those last chaotic days of March 1945, the battle ceased to be a contest of armies and became an argument between memory and oblivion. The men who fought there, both American and Japanese, had touched something elemental. They had seen fire behave as if it possessed intention, devouring stone and metal as easily as flesh. The survivors would spend the rest of their lives trying to describe it, and most would fail. In a cavern beneath Hill 362C, marine demolition specialists uncovered a small workshop built by the Japanese engineers. The air was still hot when they entered. The floor was littered with rusted tools, blueprints fused to the rock by heat, and the warped remains of a captured American flamethrower. The discovery fascinated the Marines. One of them, Sergeant Paul Dunlop, later wrote in a field letter, "They'd taken one of our flamethrowers apart. You could see where they'd measured the valves, the nozzles, even tried to draw the shape of the tanks. They must have been studying it while the island was still burning." Military historians later identified the workshop as part of Lieutenant Kanda's engineering detachment, the same men who had first examined the captured weapon. What the Marines found there were not crude imitations, but genuine research notes, pressure calculations, estimates of range, and sketches of alternate fuels. The irony was brutal. Even as their tunnels collapsed, the Japanese engineers had been trying to understand the science of their own destruction. They wanted to know how the Americans had made fire flow like water. Among the recovered items was a small notebook written in precise technical Japanese. The final entry read, "Fuel mixture creates sustained projection of flame beyond expected limits. Range approximately 20 meters under field pressure. Not possible to reproduce under present conditions. Lack of compressed nitrogen and refined gasoline. But principle understood combustion by forced pressure, not gravity. Fire given shape." The last three words, "fire given shape," were underlined twice. While Japanese engineers tried to master the weapon's mechanics, the Marines who carried it were fighting a different battle, one of conscience. The flamethrower teams were among the most exposed men on the island. Each carried 70 pounds of volatile fuel on his back, connected to a nozzle that could turn a breath of wind into a death sentence. A single bullet in the wrong spot could ignite the tanks. Because of this, the Marines often fought in pairs, the operator and his guard. Private First Class Harold Gibson, who survived Iwo Jima and later Okinawa, described the experience years afterward. "When you pulled that trigger, you didn't think about killing, you thought about clearing. You were clearing a hole so the next man could move up. But when the flame went in, you knew there were men in there. You could hear them sometimes. That sound stays with you." For the operators, the weapon's 60-foot reach was both salvation and curse. It kept them far enough to survive, yet close enough to feel the heat bounce back. The reflections off volcanic rock created momentary mirages. Walls seemed to ripple, and the air turned liquid. After the war, many veterans refused to talk about it at all. In official histories, their accounts were reduced to statistics. One flamethrower team neutralized bunker #27. But behind every number was a moral reckoning that language could barely touch. In 1948, a Marine chaplain named Reverend Thomas Kelly wrote a report for the U.S. Navy's post-war ethics study. He quoted one anonymous operator who said simply, "We carried fire, and it never really left our hands." Back in Japan, news of Iwo Jima's loss was censored at first. The Imperial General Staff announced that the garrison had fought honorably to the last man. Only in coded internal memoranda did officers admit what had truly happened, that an entire defensive doctrine had collapsed. One such memorandum, declassified decades later, contained a chilling line. Fortifications proved vulnerable to weapons projecting fire under pressure. This development must be considered decisive in island operations. Japanese military academies studied these reports secretly. Young officers were shown diagrams of Iwo Jima's tunnels and asked how they would have countered the flamethrower. The exercise had no answer. The only defense, they concluded, would have been mobility, a lesson learned too late. For the families of the dead, the truth emerged slowly. Letters from the front mentioned heat, smoke, and light filling the tunnels, but rarely used the word fire. In the post-war years, when survivors like Corporal Nakagawa's younger brother sought information, they found silence. The stigma of dying underground, burned beyond recognition, was unbearable. By the late 1952, as Japan rebuilt, Iwo Jima became a symbol of both tragedy and rebirth. Pilgrimages to the island began, and former soldiers placed small wooden plaques near the collapsed tunnels. One inscription, photographed by a U.S. naval observer in 1962, read, "Here, the walls melted. May the fire that took us guard the peace." For the United States, the flamethrower represented not cruelty but efficiency. In 1945, American strategists were preparing for the invasion of Okinawa and ultimately the Japanese mainland. Every lesson from Iwo Jima was studied in detail. Reports emphasized the need for more fuel-efficient systems and greater projection range. The result was the M2A17 model, with an improved nitrogen regulator and an effective range of nearly 75 feet. At the same time, engineers developed tank-mounted flamethrowers like the POACWSH-1, essentially a Sherman tank that breathed fire instead of shells. On Okinawa, these machines became the terror of the battlefield. The Japanese soldiers who had survived Iwo Jima's inferno recognized the sound instantly, the hiss of pressure building, the guttural roar as the flame erupted. One officer later confessed, "At Iwo, we thought the fire had defeated, to us. At Okinawa, we understood it was only the beginning." But the story of the flamethrower did not end there. After the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the weapon's psychological power was eclipsed by something far greater. Fire on a human scale was replaced by fire on a planetary one. In 1946, as the world entered the nuclear age, military analysts quietly concluded that the flamethrower had reached its moral and tactical limit. It had served its purpose to break the fortresses of a dying empire, but its legacy would forever carry the smell of burned stone. 2 decades later, the island was silent again. The coral beaches were overgrown, the tunnels sealed by ash. American and Japanese teams returned periodically to recover remains. In 1968, during one such mission, a joint excavation near Hill 382 uncovered a chamber untouched since the battle. Inside lay rusted helmets, melted rifles, and a collection of small notebooks, the engineers' records. Among them was a page marked with soot, containing a single sentence written in English. "The range is 60 feet, but its reach is everywhere." No one knows which soldier wrote it. Perhaps one of the engineers had studied English before the war. Perhaps it was a fragment copied from a captured manual. But the sentence captured something deeper than measurement. It spoke to the psychological range of fire, the distance between invention and annihilation. During the excavation, a former Japanese officer who had returned as part of the memorial team stood before the blackened walls and whispered, "We lived inside the mountain, and the mountain caught fire." His American counterpart, a Marine veteran named Captain Rex Walters, replied softly, "We burned it because we couldn't reach you any other way." That brief exchange summarized the entire tragedy of Iwo Jima, 2 sides forced into extremes, each believing they were fulfilling duty, neither fully understanding what they were destroying. By the late 20th century, Iwo Jima had become less a battlefield than a monument. In Japanese textbooks, it appeared as a lesson in courage, in American ones, as proof of determination. Yet both narratives avoided the deeper truth, that the island was a laboratory of industrialized despair. Historians began to revisit the battle with new eyes, focusing not on strategy but on experience. The flamethrower, once treated as a mere instrument, emerged as a symbol of modernity's moral dilemma, the ability to kill efficiently without seeing the enemy's face. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the battle, survivors from both sides met at a ceremony organized by veterans groups. They exchanged photographs, medals, even fragments of equipment. An aging Marine handed a rusted nozzle from an M2 flamethrower to a Japanese engineer's son. "It was your father's," he said. "We found it near the tunnel entrance. I kept it all these years, thought maybe it belonged home." The son accepted it silently, then bowed. "My father studied this," he said. "He wanted to know how it worked. Not to destroy, but to understand." For a moment, the past and present touched not through victory or defeat, but through comprehension. Today, military museums display flamethrowers behind glass, their tanks polished and inert. Visitors stare at them as relics of a brutal age. Few realize that each component, the regulator, the hose, the twin cylinders, once represented the convergence of chemistry and fear. The principle was simple: liquid fuel mixed with compressed gas, ignited by a spark plug at the nozzle. But behind that simplicity lay a revolution. The weapon turned energy itself into precision. It taught armies that fortifications could no longer guarantee safety, that the battlefield had moved into the realm of atmosphere. When historians describe the end of the static defense era, they usually mention air power, tanks, or nuclear weapons. Yet, in truth, it began on a volcanic island in the Pacific, when men with torches of steel proved that walls could burn. And perhaps that is why the story of Iwo Jima still resonates. It was not merely a clash of empires, but a revelation that technology, once unleashed, transforms not only tactics but humanity's understanding of itself. At sunset, the shadows on Iwo Jima stretch long across the ash. The wind carries faint traces of sulfur, the same smell that once mixed with burning fuel. A few monuments stand along the ridges, one for the Marines who raised the flag, another for the Japanese who died defending the island. Visitors often remark on the silence. There are no birds, no insects, only the sound of waves breaking against black sand. Yet for those who listen closely, the island still speaks. The tunnels breathe faint draughts of hot air, as if the ground itself remembers the fire that once filled it. A plaque near the old airfield bears a bilingual inscription. "From fire we learned the limits of strength, from ashes the duty to understand." That is the true legacy of the Japanese soldiers who examined the American flamethrower. In the moment they realized its 60-foot reach made bunkers useless. They also glimpsed the edge of the modern world, a world where courage could no longer shield men from the science they had unleashed. The fire has long since burned out, but its light remains not in the glow of destruction, but in the understanding that followed. And so the island endures, silent, black, and eternal. The place where belief met physics, and where the human spirit learned, once more, the cost of giving fire a shape. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.